Silas Croft didn't even look at her when he said it. He just dropped 3 coins on the counter, not enough to buy a loaf of bread, and told the widow standing across from him that was everything her husband's cattle were worth. 3 years of work, 3 years of her life, 3 coins. Take it or leave it, he said, already turning away. Nobody else is buying. She took it, because she had nothing left, because men like Silas Croft had spent years making sure women like Clara Voss had nowhere else to go. But that was before she found the ledger, before she found the numbers, before she walked onto a stranger's porch in the Texas dust and asked a question that would change both their lives forever. Maëtienne, if this story already has your attention, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The stagecoach didn't slow down so much as it gave up. It groaned to a stop at the edge of the Dunor property, like an old man who'd finally had enough, and Clara Voss was the last one off. She stepped down onto the cracked Texas dirt carrying 1 carpet bag and a leather ledger tucked under her arm, and she stood there in the afternoon heat looking at the ranch house the way a person looks at a closed door they're not sure they have the right to knock on. The house was plain. Weathered gray boards, a porch that sagged on one end, a yard that hadn't seen a woman's touch in years. There was a water trough that needed cleaning, a fence post leaning at the kind of angle that meant it had been meaning to fall for months but hadn't committed yet. A boy sat on the porch steps, 8 years old, maybe 9, turning a stick over in his hands with the particular focus of a child who has learned to entertain himself. He saw Clara before she reached the gate. "You the widow lady?" he called. She stopped. "I suppose I am. Uncle Hugh said you'd be coming." The boy set down the stick. "He said I wasn't to bother you." "Are you bothering me?" He thought about it seriously. "Not yet." Clara almost smiled. "What's your name?" "Leo." "Well, Leo." She shifted the carpet bag to her other hand. "Is your uncle inside?" "Out back." He hopped off the step and studied her the way children study things they're genuinely curious about, openly, without any pretense of manners. "You don't look like a housekeeper." "What does a housekeeper look like?" He scrunched up his nose. Old Mrs. Garrity smelled like lye soap, and she had arms like a blacksmith. "I'm sorry to disappoint you." "I didn't say I was disappointed." He picked the stick back up. "I'm just saying." She left him there and walked around the side of the house, and she found Hugh Dunor exactly where Leo said he'd be, out back, crouched beside a section of broken fence rail, trying to get a wire to hold with hands that were too large for the work. He didn't hear her coming. She stood and watched him fight that wire for a full minute before he felt her shadow and looked up. He was older than she'd expected, late 40s, maybe touching 50, with a face that had been outside most of its life. Deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in days, and the kind of stillness about him that comes not from peace, but from long practice at keeping things locked down. He stood up slowly. "Mrs. Voss?" "Mr. Dunor." They looked at each other for a moment the way 2 people look at each other when they've made an arrangement they're both not entirely sure about. "You find the place all right?" he asked. The driver knew it. Hugh nodded. He dropped the wire. He picked up his hat from the fence post and put it on, which seemed to be his way of signaling that a conversation was beginning. "I want to be straight with you about what I need," he said. "I'm not a man who's good at explaining things, so I'll just say it plain. The house needs managing, Leo needs watching, and I've got account books that are a disaster. I was told you had experience with numbers." "My husband was a merchant," Claire said. "I kept his books for 14 years. Hugh looked at her. "Where's he now?" "Dead." She said it without flinching. She'd had enough practice. "He left me $64 in debt and a reputation I'm still working to recover from." Something shifted in Hugh's expression. Not pity. She would have turned around and walked back to the road if it had been pity. It was more like recognition, the look of a man who understood what debt felt like. "The arrangement stands as I wrote it," he said. "You run the house, look after the boy, manage the accounts. In return, I clear the debt and give you room and board. 12 months. I understood the letter. Good. He picked up the wire again. Supper's at 6. Clara carried her carpet bag inside. Embossing. The house was worse than it looked from the outside, which she hadn't thought was possible. It wasn't filthy. Hugh Denora was clearly not a man who lived in squalor, but it had the specific kind of disorder that happens when a practical man has no system and no one to create one. Dishes clean but stacked wrong, food stored without logic, a crate of papers in the kitchen that had nothing to do with cooking. The fireplace had been swept, but only half the ash had made it into the bucket. Clara set her carpet bag at the foot of the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, the smallest room in the house, which she'd expected, and she stood in the middle of it for a moment with her hand on the leather ledger. She had kept this ledger through everything, through the months when Martin's debts started coming in, through the day the shop was locked, through the week after the funeral when creditors had stood at her door like a line of patient crows. She'd written every number in it, every dollar owed, every dollar she had, every dollar that was the difference between those two things. It was the most honest record she had of exactly how far she'd fallen. She set it on the windowsill. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to figure out what she was dealing with. Supper at 6 was cornbread and salt pork and a pot of beans that had been on too long. Clara had made it from what she found in the kitchen, working fast and without ceremony, and when Hugh came in from outside with Leo trailing behind him, she had 3 plates on the table. Hugh stopped. He looked at the 3 plates. Then he looked at Clara. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Mrs. Garrity ate in the kitchen," Leo said helpfully, climbing into his chair. Hugh didn't say anything. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, his chair, clearly, from habit, and sat down. Then, without ceremony, he picked up his fork. Clara remained standing for a half-second longer than she should have. Then she sat down too. They ate in near silence. Leo asked if he could have more cornbread. Hugh passed the plate. At one point the dog scratched at the back door and Leo looked at Hugh, who shook his head once, and Leo stopped reaching for the door handle. It was ordinary. It was almost startlingly ordinary. Clara had eaten alone for 8 months. Before that, she'd eaten in kitchens and back rooms, and once, during the worst of it, standing up over a wash basin. She had forgotten what it felt like to sit at a table with other people without it meaning something was wrong. She ate her beans and didn't let it show. That night, after Leo was in bed and Hugh had gone out to do whatever a rancher does in the dark that can't wait until morning, Clara sat at the kitchen table with his account books. There were 4 of them. She'd found them stacked behind the crate of papers, buried under a saddle blanket, which told her right away that Hugh Denora did not enjoy looking at his own finances. She opened the first one. 20 minutes later, she sat back and pressed her fingers against her eyes. The numbers weren't just messy, they were wrong. Not wrong in the way numbers get wrong when a person is careless. Wrong in the way numbers get wrong when someone is being deliberately careless on their behalf. She opened the second book. She'd been a merchant's wife for 14 years. She had learned to read accounts the way some women read faces, looking for the thing underneath the surface, the place where something didn't add up in a way that wasn't accidental. Martin had been a good man, but a soft one. And in the later years, she'd been the one to catch the suppliers who shaved weight off their deliveries, and the customers who paid in coin that turned out to be lighter than it looked. She knew what she was seeing. She just didn't know yet how deep it went. Toot. Hugh found her there at nearly 11 o'clock. He came in through the back, stopped when he saw the lamp still burning, and stood in the doorway looking at her with the account books open around her. "You're still up," he said. "So are you." He came in and hung his hat. He looked at the books, but didn't come close enough to see what she was reading. "Those are a mess, I know." "Mr. Denora." Clara looked up. "Who handles your cattle sales?" He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, which surprised her. She'd half expected him to take the books and close them and say he'd get to it later. "Broker named Silas Croft. Out of Harding County. Why?" "How long have you been working with him?" 6, 7 years. He paused. "Why?" Clara looked at the column of figures in front of her. "Because for the last 3 years, the price per head you've been recording doesn't match what cattle have been selling for in this region." She turned the book to face him. "You've been underpaid, Mr. Denora, consistently." Hugh's jaw tightened. Croft sets the prices. I don't have much say in what... He told you that. Silence. He told you the market was low, Clara said. Every year. Prices are soft, he said. Times are hard. You took what he offered because you trusted him and because you didn't have another buyer. She kept her voice even. Did you ever check what the market was actually doing? Hugh's hands rested flat on the table. I'm a rancher, he said, not a businessman. I know. She didn't say it unkindly, but someone has been counting on exactly that. He sat very still, the kind of still that isn't calm. How bad? He finally said. Clara looked at him. She had a habit, learned from years of being the one who had to tell Martin the uncomfortable truths, of not softening numbers. Numbers didn't care about feelings. You could soften how you delivered them, but you couldn't change what they said. I can't be certain until I work through all 4 books, she said. But at a rough estimate, you've been shorted somewhere between $200 and $400 over 3 years. The muscle in Hugh's jaw moved. And there's something else, she said, because she might as well say it all. Your mortgage payment. You have... She checked the date on the notice she'd found tucked in the 3rd book. 38 days. Hugh Denore looked at her across the lamplit table, and for a moment she saw something in his face that he clearly didn't let many people see. Not panic. Something older than that. Something that had been sitting in him a long time, getting heavier. I know about the mortgage, he said. I thought you might. I was going to sell the herd. Clara thought about that. At Croft's prices? Another silence. Longer this time. It would have cleared the mortgage, Hugh said, but there was no conviction in it. He was saying what he'd been telling himself, and they both knew how that worked. And left you with an empty ranch and nothing to rebuild with, Clara said, while Croft and whoever's waiting at that bank walk away with everything they've been building toward for 3 years. Hugh looked at her. You think it's planned? I think it's possible, she paused. I think that's what the books would tell me, if I had time to read them properly. He was quiet for a long moment. The clock on the shelf ticked. Outside, something, a horse or the wind, moved against the fence. Then read them, Hugh finally said. Back. She read them until 2 in the morning. By the time she closed the last one, her hand was cramped and her eyes were burning, and she knew 3 things she hadn't known when the day started. The first was that Silas Croft had been underpaying Hugh Denore for 3 years at an average of roughly 30% below market rate. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to bleed the ranch slowly. The second was that there was a loan with the Harding County Bank that had been restructured twice. And both times, the restructuring had come right after a season where Hugh's returns from Croft were particularly low, as though someone had known exactly how thin the margins would be. The third was the name on both loan documents. Ezra Croft, loan officer, Harding County Bank. Same name, same family, different office. Claire sat in the quiet kitchen with the lamp burning low and stared at that name for a long time. Then she opened her own ledger, the one she'd brought from her old life, the one with the record of every loss. And she turned to a blank page. At the top she wrote, Denore Ranch, current position. Below it she began writing numbers. Not the ones that told her how bad things were. The other ones. The accounts Hugh hadn't collected on. The debts owed to the ranch that nobody had bothered to chase. The cattle that could be sold to someone other than Silas Croft if you knew where to look. The small margins added together that could become something larger if handled right. She had 38 days. She'd worked with less. She wrote until her hand gave out. Then she closed the ledger, turned down the lamp, and went to her room. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an unfamiliar house, the creak of the boards, the wind against the window, the distant low sound of cattle somewhere in the dark. She thought about the 3 coins Silas Croft had counted out on the counter 2 months ago, the day she'd come to him trying to settle the last of Martin's livestock debts. The way he'd looked at her. Not through her. At her, the way you look at something you're assessing for value and finding insufficient. Take it or leave it. Nobody else is buying. She thought about that name written at the bottom of Hugh Denore's loan documents. Ezra Croft. She thought about 38 days. Then she stopped thinking and let herself sleep because she was going to need all of it. Clara had not slept well, but she had slept enough. That was the thing about the worst years of her life. They had taught her to function on less than she needed. Less sleep, less food, less certainty. She had learned to take what was available and make it work, the same way you learn to cook with whatever's left in the larder when the money runs out and the market is closed and there is no one coming to restock the shelves. She was up before dawn. The kitchen was cold. She built the fire herself, put the coffee on, and was back at the account books before the sky outside had made up its mind about what color it wanted to be. She had a list now. 2 pages in her own ledger, written in her cramped, precise hand. The hand of a woman who had learned that sloppy numbers cost money you didn't have. The list had 2 columns. On the left, everything the ranch owed. On the right, everything that was owed to the ranch. The left column was bad. The right column was interesting. Hugh Dunor, it turned out, had never been good at collecting what people owed him. There were 7 outstanding debts recorded in the books. Small ranchers, a feed merchant, a man named Pruitt, who had borrowed 2 horses 3 years ago and returned them and apparently considered the matter settled without any exchange of money. None of these debts were enormous, but added together, with interest calculated properly, they came to just over $90. $90 was not nothing. Hugh came down at 5:30. He stopped when he saw her at the table, the same way he'd stopped the night before, as if he kept expecting her to not be there. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "Some." She turned the ledger to face him and tapped the right-hand column. "Do you know a man named Pruitt?" Hugh poured himself coffee. He looked at the ledger from across the kitchen without moving toward it. "Dale Pruitt. Has a place about 9 miles east. He owes you for 2 horses. That was 3 years ago." "I know when it was. The debt is still valid." She pulled the ledger back. "I also have names for 6 others. I'd like to go over them with you today so I know which ones you think are worth pursuing." Hugh sat down slowly. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Outside, the sky was starting to go gray at the edges, and Clara could hear Leo moving around upstairs, the particular random thumping of a boy waking up. "Some of those men are neighbors," Hugh said. "I know." "Collecting debts from your neighbors." He stopped, started again. "It's not always as simple as the number." "No," Clara said. "It's not. That's why I'm asking you which ones to pursue, rather than just writing letters to all 7. Hugh looked at her. There was something in his expression she was starting to recognize. A recalibration, small and grudging, that happened when she said something he hadn't expected her to say. 3 of them I'd let go," he said after a moment. "Harlan Bess lost his barn last spring. Tom Curry's wife was sick half the year. And Pruitt," he stopped. "Pruitt's a drunk, but he's not mean. He probably just forgot." "That leaves 4, Clara said. "Which 4? He told her. She wrote the names down. Guttermund. Leo appeared at the kitchen door at 6, his hair going in 4 directions and 1 boot already on. He looked at the papers spread across the table and at Clara, who had moved the account books to the side to make room for the cornbread she'd put together while Hugh was talking. "Are you fighting?" Leo asked. "No," Hugh said. "You're talking very serious." "Serious isn't fighting," Clara said. "Sit down. Boot goes on before you come to the table." Leo looked at his 1 bootless foot as though surprised to find it that way. He went back to the doorway, put on the boot, and came back and sat down. He ate fast, the way children eat when they're not sure the food will still be there if they slow down. And Clara noted that, filed it away, didn't comment on it. "What are we doing today?" Leo asked Hugh. "Working. Can I come?" "You've got reading." Leo's face fell with the theatrical despair of a child who considers reading a personal injustice. He looked at Clara. "Do I have to?" "Yes," she said, "and arithmetic." "I already know arithmetic." "How much does 2% of $90 come to?" Leo stared at her. "That's not arithmetic, that's a trick." "It's arithmetic," Clara said. "Work it out after breakfast." Hugh's mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something. Nagan. The first letter went out that afternoon, addressed to a rancher named Gideon Webb, who owed Hugh $41 for a bull he'd bought on credit 2 seasons back. Clara wrote it herself, at the kitchen table, with Hugh standing behind her reading over her shoulder in a way that she suspected he thought was subtle. "You don't have to watch," she said without turning around. "I'm not watching. I'm standing here." "You're reading my letter." A pause. "It's my letter." "Then sit down and I'll read it to you when I'm done." She dipped the pen. "Unless you'd like to write it yourself." He sat down. The letter was not aggressive. Clara had learned from years of watching Martin handle and mishandle creditors that aggression in a debt letter almost always made the situation worse. What worked was specificity: date, amount, terms, a clear record that showed you knew exactly what was owed and when, and a deadline, not a threat, just a date by which you expected the matter resolved. She gave Webb 3 weeks. "He might not pay," Hugh said when she read it aloud. "He might not," she agreed, "but right now the number in your books is 0. Even if he pays half, it's better than 0. Hugh was quiet for a moment. "You think like a merchant." "I was a merchant's wife." "Not the same thing." Clara set down the pen. "No," she said, "it's not. A merchant's wife who keeps the books and writes the letters and talks to the suppliers and covers for her husband when he's made a bad decision is not the same thing as a merchant." She looked at him steadily. "But she knows everything the merchant knows, sometimes more." Hugh held her gaze. Then he nodded, once, and didn't argue the point. 3 days into her time at Dunor Ranch, Clara rode into Harding with Hugh to post the letters and collect some supplies. She hadn't asked to come. She'd simply been ready when he brought the wagon around, and he hadn't told her not to. Harding was not a large town. One main street, a handful of buildings that leaned on each other for structural confidence, a general store that smelled like leather and dust and old coffee. Clara had been through it once before, the day she'd arrived, just long enough to see that it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and where a widow woman carrying a carpet bag and a ledger would be noticed and assessed before she'd walked half a block. She was right about that. At the general store, while Hugh loaded feed, a woman named Mrs. Alderton, who ran the post office side of things, looked at Clara over her spectacles with the frank appraisal of someone who had not developed social manners. "You're the woman out at the Dunor place," she said. It wasn't a question. "Clara Voss," Clara said. She handed over the letters. "These need posting." Mrs. Alderton looked at the addresses. Her eyebrows rose fractionally. "Collecting old debts?" "Organizing accounts," Clara said pleasantly. Mrs. Alderton looked at her a moment longer. Then, without particular warmth but without hostility, she stamped the letters. "People here thought Hugh Dunor would lose that ranch by summer," she said. "Not gossiping, just stating what's known." "Is that right?" Clara said. "Silas Crofts had his eye on that property a long time." She set the letters in the outbox and looked at Clara directly. "You know who Silas Croft is?" "I've heard the name." Mrs. Alderton's expression was hard to read. "I imagine you have," she said. And then a man came in, wanting stamps, and the conversation ended. Clara walked out into the street and stood there a moment in the mid-morning heat. She thought about the way Mrs. Alderton had said it. Silas Crofts had his eye on that property a long time. Not "I heard" or "some say." Just stated it the way you state something everyone in town already knows. She thought about Ezra Croft at the bank. She thought about the restructured loan. She thought about the timing. Hugh came out of the store with a sack of flour over one shoulder. He looked at her face. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing." She walked to the wagon. "Mrs. Alderton knows Silas Croft." "Everybody knows Silas Croft." "She said he's had his eye on your property." Hugh lifted the flour into the wagon bed. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "He made me an offer 2 years ago. Buy the whole ranch. I said no." "What did he say when you said no?" Hugh's jaw worked. "Said I'd regret it." Clara climbed onto the wagon seat. "I expect he meant that." On the ride back, Leo, who had insisted on coming and been wedged between them on the bench, fell asleep against Clara's arm somewhere around the 2nd mile. She didn't move him. Hugh drove and didn't say anything about it. After a while, Hugh said, "You asked Mrs. Alderton about Croft?" "She brought him up herself." "People in town think I'm losing the ranch," he said. "Not angry, just stating it." People in town might be right if things don't change in the next 35 days, Clara said. I'm not going to lie to you about the numbers. Hugh looked at the road. I've never had anyone manage my accounts before. Mrs. Garrity cooked and cleaned. That was it. I know. I'm not used to... He stopped. To what? To someone sitting at my table telling me my business. Clara looked at Leo's sleeping face against her sleeve. Would you prefer I didn't? A long pause. No, he said finally. I just need to get used to it. That's fair, she said. They drove the rest of the way in quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, which was more than Clara had expected from day 3. Barsim. The first reply came back in 6 days. Gideon Webb. $41, in full, with a note that said simply, sorry for the delay. Should have settled this sooner. Webb. Clara put the money in the ranch's account box and wrote the number in the right-hand column of her ledger with a satisfaction she didn't bother trying to hide. She was alone in the kitchen when she wrote it, and she let herself sit with it for a moment. That number, that small, solid proof that the plan was not just a plan, but a thing that was working. Then she got up and started the next letter. By the end of the second week, 2 more had paid. 1 partial, 1 in full. The total collected came to $63. Not enough. Not close to enough. But it was motion, and motion was different from standing still. Hugh watched all of this with a combination of skepticism and something else she couldn't quite name. He wasn't a man who asked a lot of questions, but she'd catch him sometimes looking at the ledger when she left it open on the table. Looking at the columns, the way you look at something you want to understand but don't yet trust yourself to touch. One evening, he sat down across from her while she was working and didn't say anything for a long while. Just sat. Clara finished the column she was adding and looked up. You want to know something, she said. I want to know how you know what to do, he said. You talk about market prices and loan structures, and where did you learn all that? I told you, Martin's accounts. Your husband? Yes. You did all of it? The whole business? Clara set down her pen. In the last 4 years, yes. Before that, we did it together. In the beginning, he taught me. Then, she paused because the next part was not a simple story. Then his health started failing, and I took over more. And then all of it. And then the business started failing too, for reasons that had nothing to do with the accounts. He'd made promises to suppliers he couldn't keep, borrowed against stock that didn't exist yet. And I spent the last 2 years trying to hold together something that was already broken. But you couldn't. No. She picked up the pen again. But I learned everything there is to know about the inside of a failing business, which is, it turns out, more useful than I expected. Hugh was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your husband. Thank you. She meant it, even though she'd said it 100 times, and mostly it came out hollow. From him it didn't, which surprised her. Was he a good man? Hugh asked. It was the kind of question most people didn't ask because they didn't actually want to know the answer. Clara looked at him. He was a kind man, she said carefully, and a weak one, which aren't always the same thing. Hugh nodded. He seemed to understand that. But on the 16th day, Clara found the second piece of the puzzle. She had been going back through the oldest of Hugh's account books, the one from 6 years ago, when he'd first started working with Silas Croft, looking for the beginning of it. And she found it. The first season where the price per head dropped below market. Not by much. Just enough to be explained away. A bad market, dry summer, buyers being cautious. But she also found in the same book a notation Hugh had made and then apparently forgotten about. A letter from another broker, a man named Carson out of Millfield, offering to buy his spring herd at a price that was significantly higher than what Croft had eventually paid. Hugh had turned it down. She brought the book to him that evening, showed him the notation. He stared at it for a long time. I remember that, he said. Croft told me Carson was unreliable, said he'd had men stiffed by Carson's outfit, said I was better off with a broker I knew. Did you know anyone else who'd worked with Carson? No, just what Croft told me. Clara looked at him. I think Croft knew exactly what Carson was offering. I think he made sure you turned it down. The silence that followed was a particular kind, but the kind that happens when a person is realizing they were played, and the humiliation of it sits alongside the anger in a way that's hard to separate. 6 years, Hugh said, at least 3 where the numbers show it clearly. Maybe from the beginning. He sat across from me. Hugh's voice was very flat. Shook my hand, told me he was looking out for me. Yes, Clara said. And the whole time, yes. Hugh stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at nothing for a long moment. Clara let him. She'd learned in this 2 weeks she'd been here that he was not a man who processed things quickly or out loud. He needed space to get from one side of something to the other. When he turned around, his face was controlled again. What do we do? We don't confront him yet, Clara said. If he knows we know, he'll move faster. He'll pressure the bank to accelerate the loan. We need the mortgage payment in hand before he finds out we've been looking at the books. You think he's watching? I think a man who has spent 6 years building something this careful is paying attention to whether it's working. She paused. How often does he come out here? Every season, for the cattle sale. When's the next one due? Hugh calculated. 6 weeks, maybe. He usually sends a man out first to count the herd. So we have time, Claire said. A little. Not much. No. She closed the account book. Not much. That night, after Hugh had gone out and Leo had finally gone to sleep after the third reminder, Clara sat alone in the kitchen with her ledger open in front of her and did the math again. She did it slowly, checking every number twice, the way she'd always done. Not because she didn't trust herself, but because trust without verification was how people ended up surprised by numbers at the worst possible moment. The mortgage payment was $212. They had 63 in hand. 3 remaining debtors who hadn't replied. 2 possible cattle buyers she'd found through careful questions at the general store in Harding, not Croft's contacts, other men who bought independently and paid fair prices. And a small amount in the ranch's account that Hugh had been holding back, not out of strategy but out of stubbornness because he hadn't wanted to touch it. She added the most conservative estimates of all of it. She was still $47 short. She sat with that number for a long time. $47 was not an impossible gap. It was also not a gap that closed itself. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger. She wrote the number at the top, 47. Below it, she started writing possibilities. Some of them were thin. One of them, a thought she'd had earlier in the week and set aside because it felt too bold, she wrote down now and underlined. She looked at it for a moment. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about Silas Croft and 6 years and the way a man shakes your hand while he's robbing you blind, and about whether she was bold enough to do what she'd written down. By the time she fell asleep, she had decided that she was. The bold thing she'd written down and underlined was this: contact Carson directly. It was not a complicated idea. It was, in fact, the most obvious idea, which was exactly why she'd set it aside the first time. Obvious ideas had a way of looking simple until you got close enough to see all the ways they could go wrong. Carson was a broker out of Millfield, 2 counties over. She didn't know him. She had no way to verify whether Silas Croft's claim that he was unreliable was a lie or a warning. And if she reached out to Carson and word got back to Croft before she was ready, the entire plan collapsed. But the $47 gap was not closing itself. She brought it to Hugh the next morning before Leo came down, while the coffee was still the first cup and the day hadn't decided to be difficult yet. Carson, Hugh said, just the name. His expression went carefully neutral. You remember what he offered for the spring herd 6 years ago? I remember Croft told me not to touch him. I know what Croft told you, Clara said. I'm asking what you remember about Carson himself. Did you ever meet him, talk to him directly? Hugh was quiet, turning his cup in his hands. Once, at a stockyard auction in Millfield, maybe 8 years back, before I started using Croft. He seemed straightforward, no different from any other broker. Did he cheat anyone you knew of? No, but I only knew what Croft said after. Clara looked at her ledger. The story Croft told you about men being stiffed by Carson, did he name anyone? Give you a specific case? Hugh thought about it. The pause was long enough that she could see him actually searching his memory, rather than just reaching for the first answer. No, he said finally. He just said it, like it was known. Like it was known, she repeated. Yeah. She wrote Carson, Millfield, at the top of a fresh page. I want to write to him. Not about the current herd, not yet. Just to feel out whether he's buying, what his rates look like, whether he's the kind of man who writes back promptly. Hugh set down his cup. And if Croft finds out we're talking to another broker? Croft doesn't own your business, Hugh. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She didn't notice it immediately, and neither, apparently, did he. He acts like he does, but he doesn't. You can talk to any broker you want. I know that, Hugh said, and there was an edge to it. Not at her, she thought, but at himself, for having not acted like he knew it sooner. Then I'll write the letter today, she said. He nodded. He picked up his cup again, and then Leo's feet hit the floor upstairs with the sound of a small person who treated gravity as a minor inconvenience, and the morning moved on. She wrote to Carson. She also, that same day, rode out to Dale Pruitt's place herself. Hugh had offered to go. She'd told him no, and when he'd started to argue, she'd said simply, "You said Pruitt's not mean. I can handle not mean." Hugh had looked at her for a moment, then looked away and not argued further, which was a version of trust she was willing to accept. Pruitt's place was 9 miles east, and it looked like a man lived there who had good intentions and poor follow-through. The fence needed work. The garden had been started and then neglected. The house itself was sturdy enough, but the porch had a broken board that had been broken long enough for the wood around it to gray and splinter at the edges. Pruitt himself was around back, working on something with a mule that the mule was not cooperating with. He was a big man gone soft in the middle, with a red face and the particular careful movements of someone who had a headache he was working around. He saw Clara and the mule took the opportunity to shift sideways. "Damn it!" Pruitt said, not at her. "Sorry to interrupt," Clara said. "You're the woman from Dunore's place." He straightened up. He had the look of a man who knew why she was there and was constructing his face to deal with it. "Clara Voss," she said. "I'm managing Mr. Dunore's accounts. He sent you to collect on those horses." "He sent me to talk," Clara said. "The debt's in the books. 3 years back, 2 horses, agreed price of $22. I'm not here to make trouble, Mr. Pruitt. I'm here to ask you what the situation is and whether there's a way to settle it." Pruitt's jaw worked. He looked at the mule, who was standing still now with the expression of an animal that had gotten what it wanted. I know times haven't been good," Clara said, and she kept her voice even, without edge. "I'm a widow, with $64 in debt against my name. I understand times." She paused. "But Hugh Dunore has a mortgage payment due in 22 days, and he's owed money he never pressed people to pay. I'm pressing now, politely." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment, then he rubbed the back of his neck. "I got $14 cash," he said. "I could do 14 now and the rest." 14 now and a note for the remaining 8, due in 60 days, Clara said. "That I can work with." He blinked, like he'd expected more of a fight and wasn't sure what to do without one. "That's fair?" he said. "Good." She pulled out the small notebook she'd started carrying. "I'll write the note here, you sign it, we're settled on everything except the $8, and that's 60 days away." Pruitt paid her the $14 in bills that looked like they'd been through hard times. She wrote the note, he signed it with the concentrated effort of a man who didn't write often, and she rode back to the ranch with $14 in her pocket and the particular satisfaction of a thing done that most people would have put off. The reply from Carson came faster than she'd expected. 8 days after she posted the letter, the reply was in her hand, a single page, written in a businesslike hand that matched the tone of his words. He was buying. His rates for the current season were listed. They were, Clara noted with a quiet and vindicated satisfaction, 14% higher than what Croft had paid Hugh the previous year. She read the letter 3 times. Then she took it to Hugh. He read it once. His expression didn't change much, but something moved through his eyes that she recognized. The particular anger of a man understanding, for the first time in concrete terms, exactly how much he'd been lied to. 14%, he said. "At minimum," Clara said. "And that's his opening rate. If you come to him with a full herd and good numbers, he may go higher." Croft has buyers lined up. He expects my cattle. Croft expects whatever you let him expect, Clara said. You haven't made any agreement for the season yet. Have you signed anything? No, we always just... Hugh stopped. It was always just understood. Understood isn't a contract, Clara said. He set the letter down on the table. He put both hands flat on the surface, the same way he'd done the night she'd first showed him the discrepancies, as if he needed something solid under his palms to think clearly. If I go to Carson and Croft finds out, he'll find out eventually, Clara said. What we need is for him to find out after the mortgage is paid. That's what the timing matters. She sat down across from him. Carson's terms give us enough to close the gap. With what we've collected, what we're expecting from the last 2 debtors, and a sale to Carson at his listed rate. Hugh, we're close enough that I can see the other side of it. He looked at her. How close? If everything I'm counting on comes through, we clear the mortgage with somewhere between $12 and $20 left over. That's a thin margin. It is, she said. But it's a margin. Right now we have no margin at all. Hugh was quiet for a while. He picked up Carson's letter again, read something in it a second time. Then he put it down. All right, he said. Write back to Carson. Tell him we're interested. I already drafted it, Clara said. I just needed your say before I sent it. He looked at her. You already... He stopped, shook his head. Not angry. Something closer to wry. Of course you did. Eats. Leo had started sitting with her in the evenings while she worked. She hadn't invited him. He'd just started appearing, first standing in the doorway, then gradually migrating to the chair across from her, bringing whatever he was working on, which was sometimes a school book and sometimes a piece of rope he was trying to knot in a specific way he'd seen one of the ranch hands do. Clara didn't tell him to go away. She didn't fuss over him either. She just let him be there, which she suspected was what he actually needed. He was a quiet boy mostly. Not shy. He'd proven that the first day, but contained. He watched people carefully, the way children do when they've learned that adults are unpredictable and that watching gives you a slight advantage. One evening he looked up from his rope and said, "Why did you come here?" Clara didn't look up from her ledger. "I told you, an arrangement with your uncle." "Because of the debt." "Yes." "My mother had debt," Leo said. He said it plainly, the same way he said most things, without drama. "That's why she couldn't keep me." Clara looked up then. Leo was working at the rope knot. His eyes were on his hands. "Uncle Hugh says she might come back someday, when things are better for her." "What do you think?" Clara asked. He considered it with more seriousness than most adults gave the question. "I think Uncle Hugh says things like that, so I don't feel bad," he said. "He thinks I don't know." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You're a perceptive boy, Leo." "What's perceptive?" "Means you notice things." "Oh." He tried the knot. It slipped. He started over. "Are you going to leave too, when the 12 months are up?" Clara looked back at her ledger. It was a fair question. She didn't have an answer that was both honest and comfortable, and she'd made a rule for herself, somewhere in the last 3 years, that she wouldn't offer the comfortable answer if she didn't know whether it was true. "I don't know yet," she said. "A lot depends on how the next few weeks go." Leo seemed to accept that. He went back to his rope. After a minute, he said, "I hope you don't." Clara didn't answer, but she wrote the next number in her column very carefully, and her hand was steadier than she expected. 20 days before the mortgage was due, Silas Croft's man came to count the herd. His name was Deaver, a lean, watchful man in his 40s with the specific manner of someone who had been doing another man's dirty work long enough to have adopted that man's habits without his confidence. He arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, rode up to the fence, and called out for Hugh before he'd even dismounted. Hugh came out of the barn. Clara watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear the exchange from there, but she saw Deaver's posture. Easy, proprietary, the posture of a man who considered himself to be arriving at somewhere he had some claim over. She saw Hugh's posture too, square, controlled, not giving anything away. After 10 minutes, Deaver left without counting the herd. Hugh came inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara. He wanted to schedule the sale, Hugh said. For when? 2 weeks out. Said Croft has buyers coming through, wants first access to the herd before they move on. Clara turned from the window. What did you tell him? Told him I was still deciding on timing. Hugh's jaw was set. He didn't like that. No, she said. He wouldn't. She crossed to the table and looked at her ledger. The mortgage was due in 20 days. Carson had agreed to buy, at a date she'd coordinated carefully, 18 days out. That gave them 2 days before the deadline to make the payment in Harding. What exactly did Deaver say when you told him you were still deciding? He said Croft had counted on this herd, said it would be, his word was unfortunate, if the arrangement fell through. Said Croft was a good friend to the ranch and he hoped that was remembered. Claire's eyes went to the ledger, then back to Hugh. He threatened you. He suggested things. Same thing. She sat down. How much of the ranch hand situation do you trust? Your men? If Croft sent someone out here with trouble in mind, who would stand with you? Hugh looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. That's a serious thing to be asking. I know what kind of question it is. 2 of them, yes. The other 2 are newer. Don't know yet. He came all the way into the kitchen and sat down. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical work. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something too long. You think he'd send someone? I think a man who's spent 6 years engineering a situation doesn't walk away from it because someone says still deciding on timing, Clara said. I think he'll want to know what's changed, and when he starts looking, he'll eventually find Carson. How soon? I don't know. It depends on who talks and to whom. She paused. We should assume sooner rather than later. Hugh was quiet for a moment. Then, we could move the sale date up. Ask Carson if he can come earlier. I thought about that. The risk is that rushing it gives us worse terms, and Carson may not be able to move his buyers on short notice. We lose money we don't have room to lose. She shook her head. We hold to the plan, but we need to be ready for Croft to show up here before it's done. And if he does? Clara looked at him steadily. Then I'll deal with him. Hugh's eyebrow went up slightly. You? He doesn't know what I know yet, she said. That's an advantage that disappears the moment the herd is sold and the mortgage is paid. But right now, if he shows up here thinking I'm a housekeeper who doesn't understand what she found in those books... She let that sentence finish itself. Hugh looked at her for a long moment. You want him to underestimate you. He already does, she said. I just want to make sure he's still doing it when he gets here. Croft arrived on a Thursday without Deaver, without warning, 8 days before the mortgage was due. Clara was on the porch. She'd been sitting there going over numbers. She'd started bringing the ledger outside in the afternoons because the light was better and because the open air made the tighter numbers breathe a little easier. When she heard the horse on the road, she watched the rider come up the track and recognized, even at a distance, the particular way Silas Croft sat a horse, like a man who was accustomed to arriving places where he was expected. She did not go inside, she did not stand up. She set the ledger across her knees and waited. He was maybe 55, Croft. Well-dressed for ranch country, not fussy, but better than working clothes. A face that had once been handsome and now was something harder, with eyes that were the pale, flat color of creek water in August. He pulled up at the fence and looked at the porch. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not what she expected. She'd expected dismissal. What she got was assessment, like he was recalibrating something. Ma'am, he said, I'm looking for Hugh Denore. He's not here, Clara said. Can I help you? Croft swung down from the horse and tied it at the post. He walked up toward the porch with the easy stride of a man who considered himself welcome everywhere. I'm Silas Croft. I work with Hugh on his cattle business. I had a message that there was some question about the sale timing. There's no question, Clara said. Mr. Denore's decided to sell to another buyer this season. Croft stopped at the base of the porch steps. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her 6 years ago across a different counter, with the measuring look of someone calculating value and finding the number insufficient. Except this time there was something else underneath it, something that was trying to figure out what it was dealing with. Another buyer, he said. That's right. Hugh didn't mention any other... He didn't need to mention it to you, Clara said. He's not obligated to use your services, Mr. Croft. He's been using them, but that's different. Croft's expression shifted, barely, but she caught it. And you are? Clara Voss. I manage Mr. Dunour's accounts. She held his gaze. I've been managing them very carefully. A pause. The kind of pause that meant he was reassessing. Mrs. Voss, he said with a slight emphasis on the Mrs. that was meant to be diminishing. I think there may be some misunderstanding. Hugh and I have an arrangement going back 6 years, Clara said. Yes, I know. I've read every transaction for all 6 years. She looked at him steadily. Every one of them. The pause this time was different, longer. I'm sure the books are thorough, she said. They're thorough. I've been very thorough. She opened the ledger in her lap to a page she'd prepared and looked at it, not to remind herself of the numbers, she had them memorized, but to let him see the columns. The last 3 seasons in particular are very well documented. The market rates, what you paid, what the difference amounts to over time. She looked up. It's a significant number, Mr. Croft. He stood very still at the base of the steps. For the first time since she'd watched him ride up the track, Silas Croft was not sure what he was walking into. She could see it happen. The recalibration, the attempt to get back to the version of this conversation he'd planned on the ride over. The one where the housekeeper said, "Oh, I'll tell him you called," and he left having learned something useful. I think, he said slowly, that whatever you think you've found in those books. What I've found, Clara said, is 3 years of deliberate underpayment averaging 31% below regional market rate, coordinated with loan restructuring through your uncle's office at Harding County Bank. Time to ensure that Hugh Dunour would be consistently short of the margin needed to pay his mortgage without selling under pressure. She kept her voice completely level. That's what I found. Croft's face went very still. Now, Clara said, you're welcome to tell me I've made a mistake. You're welcome to sit down and go through the numbers with me. I have all of them here. She placed one hand on the ledger. But I would think carefully before you do, because I've checked them 4 times, and I don't make arithmetic mistakes. Silas Croft looked at her for a long moment. The pale, flat eyes had gone somewhere colder. You're a bookkeeper, he said. On a failing ranch. I'm the bookkeeper on a ranch that's about to make its mortgage payment on time, Clara said. Whether you're involved in the cattle sale or not. Another silence, longer than the last. I know exactly what I'm interfering with, Clara said. That's rather the point. Croft stood there for a moment that stretched long enough to become something else. Not just a pause, but a reckoning. A man who had spent 6 years moving pieces around a board, discovering that someone had been reading the board and had moved one of the pieces back. Then, without another word, he turned, untied his horse, and rode back down the track the way he'd come. Clara watched him go. She kept her face still and her hands flat on the ledger until he was too far away to see her clearly. Then she let out a breath that she had been holding, apparently, for several minutes. She looked down at her hands. They were not shaking. She was somewhat surprised by that. She was also, underneath everything else, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She'd been running on precision and forward momentum for 3 weeks, and sitting on that porch just now, holding the line against a man who had destroyed other people quietly and patiently for years, that had cost something. She let herself sit with it for a moment. Just a moment. Then she opened the ledger to the right page and checked the numbers one more time, because there were still 8 days left, and Silas Croft was not the kind of man who rode away from something and stayed away. She was going to need every one of those 8 days. Hugh came back that evening to find Claire at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a cold cup of coffee beside her that she hadn't touched in an hour. He read her face before he read the room. She'd noticed he did that, came into a space and checked the people in it before he checked anything else. Ranch instinct, maybe. The habit of a man who'd learned that the animal in the pen tells you more about what happened than the pen itself. Croft was here, he said. Not a question. He was. Hugh set his hat on the hook. He didn't sit down. He stood in the kitchen with his arms at his sides and looked at her with the particular stillness that meant he was containing something. What did he say? Less than he wanted to, more than he meant to. Clara turned the ledger so he could see the page she'd been staring at. I told him we'd found the discrepancies. All 3 years of them. I told him we were selling to another buyer. The muscle in Hugh's jaw moved. How'd he take that? He reminded me that I was a bookkeeper on a failing ranch. She paused. I reminded him that the ranch was about to make its mortgage payment on time. Hugh looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily, the way a man sits when the weight of a thing finally settles on him properly. You faced him down. I had the numbers, she said. The numbers did most of it. Clara. He said her name with a directness that was unusual for him. He'd been careful about it, she'd noticed, still defaulting to Mrs. Voss in front of Leo or the hands. That man has been working toward this ranch for 6 years. He doesn't stop because you showed him a ledger. I know that. Then you know he's going to come back with something worse than words. Yes, she said. I've been thinking about what that looks like. She folded her hands on the table. He has 2 options. He can try to accelerate the bank loan, pressure his uncle to call in the note early, claim some technical default, or he can try to interfere with the Carson sale directly. Make sure Carson's buyers don't show, or that something goes wrong between now and the exchange. Hugh was quiet. Can he do either of those things? The bank loan, possibly. Depends on whether the note has language that allows acceleration on demand, and whether Ezra Croft is willing to stick his neck out that far with 8 days left. If he does it, we'd need to dispute it, and that takes time we don't have. She paused. The Carson sale is harder for him to touch directly. Carson's operation is out of Millfield. Croft doesn't have reach there the way he does in Harding. What do we do? Clara looked at him. Tomorrow morning, I want to ride to Harding and look at the original loan document. I need to see exactly what language is in it. If there's no acceleration clause, Ezra Croft can't move on it, and that threat goes away. And if there is one, then we figure out what constitutes a valid trigger and make sure we haven't tripped it. She picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, and set it back down. I also want to send a rider to Carson tonight. Let him know there may be interference and ask him to confirm his buyers are still committed. Hugh looked at the window. Outside it was dark enough that there was nothing to see. I'll go to Harding myself. You shouldn't. I need to go, Clara said. The loan documents are numbers. I need to read them myself. He turned back to her. It's not safe for you to be in Harding right now. Croft has people there. So do I, she said. Mrs. Alderton. Hugh blinked. The postmistress. She's been in that town 23 years, Clara said. She knows every piece of paper that moves through it. She's already told me more than she had to. If I go to her first, before I go to the bank, she can tell me what the ground looks like before I walk onto it. She looked at him steadily. I'm not being reckless. I'm being careful in a direction you might not have thought of. Hugh sat with that for a moment. Then he exhaled, not defeat, more like the release of an argument he'd started and decided wasn't worth finishing. Fine. We go together. You'll draw more attention than I will. Then I'll wait outside. He said it in a tone that indicated this was not negotiable, and Clara, who had learned in 4 weeks which hills Hugh Dunor was going to die on, let it go sharp. They rode to Harding at first light, leaving Leo with strict instructions to stay on the property and the ranch hand named Eli, who Hugh trusted, keeping an eye on things. Leo had looked at them both with the sharp attention of a child who understands something serious is happening but has learned not to ask questions that will get him sent back to bed. He'd just nodded and said he'd finish his arithmetic while they were gone, which made Clara look at him quickly because he'd said it without any complaint whatsoever, which was not like him at all. We'll be back before supper, she told him. I know, he said, and then quietly, be careful. Hugh put a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. He didn't say anything, but Leo seemed to understand it. They rode most of the way in silence. The morning was cool, the kind of Texas cool that only exists for about 2 hours before the heat remembers itself, and Clara was glad of it. She used the ride to go over the numbers again in her head, not because they changed, but because she needed the solid feeling of them, the certainty of columns that balanced, in a morning that felt like it had too many variables. You ever been afraid? Hugh asked, maybe 3 miles out from Harding. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. His eyes were on the road. She thought about that honestly. Yes. Of what? Of being wrong about the numbers, she said. Every time I've been in a situation where the numbers were the thing standing between me and disaster, I'm always afraid I've miscounted somewhere, that there's a mistake I haven't found yet. He glanced at her. Have you? Miscounted? Once, she said. Years ago, early on, I missed a decimal in Martin's inventory accounts. Small error. Cost us $40 we didn't have. She paused. I've checked everything 4 times since then. Some things 5. The Denor accounts? 4 times each, she said. And once more, last night, while you were asleep. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a glance. Then he looked back at the road. I believe you, he said. It was a simple thing to say. Clara found, to her own slight surprise, that it landed. Mrs. Alderton was opening the post office when they arrived. She looked at Hugh, then at Clara, then at the hour, and seemed to process all 3 pieces of information simultaneously. Early for a social call, she said. We need to see the Denor loan documents at the bank, Clara said. Before we go in there, I want to know what you know about Ezra Croft. Mrs. Alderton looked down the street in both directions. The particular habit of a woman who dealt in information and understood the value of not being overheard. Come inside, she said. Inside, with the door closed, Mrs. Alderton told them 3 things. The first was that Ezra Croft had been loan officer at Harding County Bank for 11 years, and that in those 11 years, 7 properties in the county had been foreclosed on, which was not unusual in itself, but that 5 of those 7 had subsequently been purchased by a landholding company registered in a county 300 miles away, which nobody local seemed to know much about. The second was that Silas Croft had been seen at the bank the previous afternoon. The same afternoon he'd ridden away from Denor Ranch. The third was that the bank's senior officer, a man named Hartley, was not Ezra Croft's ally. He's a careful man, Mrs. Alderton said. Old family. He doesn't like messes. If there's a mess to be shown to him, he'd rather deal with it than have it become his problem later. Clara filed all 3 pieces away. Can you get us in to see Hartley directly? Mrs. Alderton looked at her. I've known Francis Hartley 20 years, she said. I can walk you through his front door. What you do once you're there is your business. The bank was small and deliberate in the way small-town banks are. Every piece of furniture chosen to communicate solidity, reliability, the sense that money left here would not run away. Clara walked in beside Mrs. Alderton and felt, not for the first time, the specific way a room recalibrates when a woman enters it expecting to conduct business. The clerk at the front desk looked at Mrs. Alderton with recognition and at Clara with assessment. Hugh had stayed outside, as agreed, though she suspected he was directly beside the front window. Is Mr. Hartley available? Mrs. Alderton said. This is Clara Voss, who manages accounts for Hugh Denor. It's time-sensitive. The clerk disappeared. He was back in 3 minutes. Francis Hartley was a compact man in his 60s, white-haired, with the careful eyes of someone who'd spent a career watching people try to get things from him under various pretexts. He looked at Clara with no particular warmth and no particular hostility. Mrs. Voss, he said, what can I do for you? I'd like to review the terms of the Denor mortgage, Clara said, specifically the acceleration clause, if there is one. I want to understand what the bank's options are in the next 8 days. Hartley's expression shifted slightly. Not much, but she caught it, the look of a man recalibrating what he'd expected this meeting to be. That's a fairly specific request. I'm a fairly specific person, Clara said. Mr. Denor's intention is to pay the mortgage in full, on time, 8 days from now. I want to make sure there's no mechanism that allows the note to be called before that payment is made. Hartley looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Come to my office. The loan document had an acceleration clause. Clara had half expected it. The clause allowed the bank to demand full payment if the borrower failed to maintain adequate security for the loan, which was language vague enough to mean almost anything if someone wanted it to. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Hartley. Has anyone requested activation of this clause? She asked. Hartley's pause was a fraction too long. I'm not able to discuss internal bank communications. Mr. Hartley, Claire said, I'm going to tell you what I believe happened, and you can stop me if I'm wrong. She kept her voice level. I believe Silas Croft visited this bank yesterday afternoon and asked his uncle to find a basis for accelerating the Du Nord loan. I believe his uncle, your loan officer, may have indicated that was possible. She placed her hands flat on the desk, the same way she'd noticed Hugh doing when he needed to steady himself. I also believe you didn't know about the arrangement between the Crofts and the terms under which Hugh Du Nord's mortgage has been restructured twice, restructured in seasons that were artificially depressed by underpayment from Silas Croft's brokerage operation. The room was very quiet. Hartley looked at her. His expression had not changed exactly, but something behind it had moved. That's a serious allegation, he said. I have 4 account books and 6 years of transaction records, Claire said. I've been through all of them. If you'd like to see the documentation, I can have it here within the hour. Hugh Du Nord rode to town with me. She paused. Or you can choose to activate that acceleration clause in the next 8 days, in which case I imagine those same documents become very interesting to a judge. Another silence. Longer. The payment, Hartley said carefully, is due in 8 days. Yes. And your expectation is that it will be made in full. My expectation is that it will be made in full, Clara said. On time. Without any interference from this bank between now and then. Hartley looked at the loan document on the desk between them. Then he looked at Clara. Then he did something she hadn't anticipated. He almost smiled. Not warmly, but with a kind of recognition, the expression of a man who has seen something he didn't expect to see and finds it, despite everything, somewhat impressive. I'll make a note, he said, that the Du Nord account is in good standing and that no acceleration action has been initiated or approved. Clara looked at him. In writing? A pause. Then he pulled out a sheet of paper. In writing, he said. Nkyan. She came out of the bank with the signed note in her hand, and Hugh was standing exactly where she'd expected him. Not beside the window, because he'd apparently decided that was too obvious, but close enough to the door that he'd reached it before she was fully out. He looked at her face. Well? He put it in writing, she said. The bank won't move on the loan before payment day. Hugh stood very still for a moment. Then he exhaled, the kind of breath that carries something with it, something that had been held too long. Croft went to the bank yesterday, Claire said, walking, keeping her voice low. He tried to trigger the acceleration clause. Hartley didn't go along with it, but I think that was less about ethics and more about not wanting to be associated with it if the documentation becomes public. He protected himself, Hugh said. Yes, but the effect is the same. We have 8 days, and the bank won't touch us. They walked in silence for half a block. Then Hugh said, What about Croft himself? He can't touch the Carson sale from here, and without the bank moving early, he has no other mechanism before the payment date. She paused. That doesn't mean he won't try something. He's not a man who accepts being outmaneuvered quietly. No, Hugh said. He's not. We need Eli watching the herd tonight. Both of your trusted hands out there, not just one. Done. He said it without hesitation, which told her he'd already been thinking about it. They found Mrs. Alderton outside her post office, ostensibly sorting mail, actually watching the street. Clara stopped. Thank you, she said. Mrs. Alderton looked at the signed banknote in Clara's hand. Hartley put it in writing. She said it with the satisfaction of someone who'd correctly guessed an outcome. Good. He's not a corrupt man, just a cautious one. She went back to her mail. Payment day is in 8 days. Don't dawdle. 1. They didn't dawdle. The next 5 days were the most precise, exhausting, forward-moving days of Clara's life, and she had not lived an uneventful life. Carson's rider came on the 4th day to confirm the sale date and inspect the herd, and Clara stood at the fence watching the man count cattle with the concentrated attention of someone who has everything riding on a number coming out right. It came out right. Slightly better than right. One of the heifers Clara had thought was in marginal condition had recovered well enough to grade up, which added $11 to the estimate. She wrote the new number in her ledger and allowed herself 30 seconds of pure, uncomplicated relief. Then she went back to work. Hugh had his 2 trusted hands watching the herd in shifts. Nothing happened. No interference, no missing cattle, no cut fences. Either Croft had decided the risk of overt action was too high, or he was choosing to let it play out and look for another angle after the fact. Clara thought it was probably the second one, which meant this wasn't over when the mortgage was paid. But she'd deal with that when she got to it. Right now, she needed to get to the payment. On the sixth day, Leo found her at the kitchen table at 11 at night and didn't say anything for a long while, just sat across from her. Clara was doing the final reconciliation, making sure every number she was counting on was accounted for and real. "You haven't eaten supper," Leo said. "I ate something earlier." "I didn't see you eat." She looked up. He was in his nightclothes with the serious expression of a boy who had decided to be concerned and was not going to be talked out of it easily. "Leo, it's past 11 o'clock. I know, I couldn't sleep." He pulled his feet up onto the chair rungs. "Uncle Hugh can't sleep either. He's been walking around outside for an hour." Clara looked at the window. She could see the faint movement of a lamp outside, crossing the yard. She set down her pen. "The numbers are good," she said, because that was what he was actually asking. "We have enough." Leo looked at her. "Are you sure?" "I've checked them enough times that I'm sure," she said. "That's the best I can offer." He seemed to think about whether that was sufficient. Then, "Okay," he said. And he got down from the chair and went back to bed without further argument, which was possibly the most trusting thing anyone had done for her in years. She sat with that for a moment. Then she closed the ledger, stood up, and went to the door. Hugh was in the yard, as Leo had said. He heard her come out and turned. He didn't say anything. She walked to the fence beside him, and they stood there in the dark, looking at the land. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he said. The cattle were quiet shapes in the far dark. Somewhere an owl moved through the air without any sound at all. "I owe you an apology," Hugh said after a while. Clara looked at him. "For what?" "For how I've been, some of this. Stubborn, not easy to work with." He said it with the specific difficulty of a man who doesn't apologize often and isn't sure he's doing it right. "You came here expecting a straightforward arrangement, and I handed you a disaster." "You didn't know it was a disaster," she said. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't look at it." He was quiet a moment. "That's worse, maybe." Clara thought about that honestly. "It's human," she said. "Most people don't look at the things that scare them. The fact that you let me look is something." He turned to face her. In the low light, she couldn't see his expression clearly, which maybe made it easier for him to say the next thing. "I don't know what I would have done without what you've done here. And I don't know how to say that without it sounding—" "You don't have to say it a particular way," Clara said. "Just say it plain." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Plain enough?" "Plain enough," she said. They stood there a little longer, the way two people stand when something has shifted between them and neither of them is ready to move away from it yet. Then the owl called from somewhere in the dark, and Hugh said he'd better check the south fence, and Clara went back inside to sleep while she still had the chance. She lay in the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen and looked at the ceiling and thought about the numbers she'd written, all the numbers from the first night to now, and how they had told a story if you knew how to read them. How they had told her, in their flat, precise language, exactly what was happening to a man who didn't know how to read them himself. She thought about 2 days. She thought about Leo saying okay and trusting her and going back to bed. She thought about Hugh in the yard, looking at his own land in the dark. Then she stopped thinking because she needed to be sharp for 2 more days, and thinking at midnight didn't help sharpness. She slept. The morning of the cattle sale, Clara woke up before the alarm she'd set in her head and lay still for exactly 30 seconds, running the numbers one final time in the dark. $212 needed. Carson's agreed payment, minus his standard handling fee, came to $189. Collected debts, $63. Pruitt's partial payment, $14. The ranch's held-back reserve that Hugh had finally, grudgingly, agreed to contribute, $22. Total, $288, $76 over the mortgage payment. She'd checked it so many times the numbers felt like her own heartbeat. Familiar, rhythmic, something that would alarm her only if it stopped. She got up, built the fire, put the coffee on, and stood in the kitchen in the early gray light, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel for the entire 5 weeks she'd been at Denora Ranch. Almost there was a dangerous feeling. She'd learned that. Almost there was when people relaxed, and relaxing before the thing was done was how the thing didn't get done. She drank her coffee, standing up, and went to find Hugh. He was already at the fence, watching the road. He'd been up since before her, she could tell. There was a particular quality to how he stood. The settled, alert posture of a man who'd been waiting for a while and had made his peace with the waiting. "Carson's man said mid-morning," Clara said. "I know." He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the road. "Been a quiet night." "Good quiet or just quiet?" "Just quiet," he said, "which is what I expected. Croft's not stupid enough to try something he can't explain. He lost his angle when the bank wouldn't move." He paused. "Doesn't mean he's done. Just means this particular fight is done." "One fight at a time," Clara said. He looked at her then. "You worried?" "About today specifically? No." She looked at the road with him. "About what comes after? Some." He nodded, like that was the honest answer he'd expected. "Me too." They stood there together at the fence while the sky made up its mind about the day, and Clara thought about how strange it was that this, standing at a fence in the early morning with a man she'd barely known 5 weeks ago, watching a road for a cattle buyer, felt steadier than most of the things she'd stood on in the last 3 years. Carson's men arrived at 9. There were 3 of them. The buyer himself, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Ren Carson, who had the direct, unsentimental manner of someone who'd been in the cattle business long enough to find drama wasteful, and 2 hands who knew their work. Carson shook Hugh's hand. He looked at the herd. He looked at his notes. He looked at Clara, who was standing slightly back, and said, "You're the one who wrote me." "Clara Voss," she said. "You don't work for a broker." "I work for Mr. Denora," she said. Directly. Carson looked at her for a moment with the measuring look of a man recalibrating. Then he turned back to the herd and said, "Let's count them." The count took an hour. Clara stood by the fence with her ledger open and noted every head as it was tallied, not because she didn't trust Carson's men, but because her job was to know the number herself. Hugh watched from the other side, arms on the rail, face carefully neutral. When Carson came back, he had a number. It matched Clara's. "Terms as agreed," Carson said. "I'll need the bank draft made out by—" "I have a preference for cash," Clara said. Given the timeline, Carson looked at her. "Cash is a lot to carry." "It's also a lot to pay a mortgage with," she said. "Same day, no delays, no drafts that need clearing." Carson thought about it for about 4 seconds. "All right," he said. "Cash. Give me an hour." The money was on the kitchen table at 11:30. Clara counted it with Carson present. She counted it a second time. She wrote the number in her ledger, had Hugh sign beside it, and had Carson countersign as witness. Carson watched all of this with an expression somewhere between respect and amusement. "You always this careful?" he asked. "Today, especially," she said. When Carson and his men had loaded the cattle and gone, the ranch was quieter than it had been in weeks. Hugh stood in the yard looking at the space where the herd had been, and Clara stood a few feet away and let him have a moment with whatever that looked like from the inside. The particular strangeness of watching something you've built go out the gate, even willingly, even for good reason. "We'll rebuild the herd," she said, not to fill the silence, but because it was true, and he might need to hear it stated plainly. "I know," he said. He didn't sound crushed. He sounded like a man who'd put something down that was very heavy and was figuring out how to stand up straight again. "Hugh," she waited until he turned. "We need to get to Harding before the bank closes." He looked at the money. Then he looked at her. And something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, more like the moment when a person finally believes a thing they've been afraid to believe. "Right," he said. "Let's go." Leo insisted on coming, and neither of them had the heart to say no. He rode in the wagon between them again, in the same spot he'd occupied on that earlier trip to Harding, except this time he was wide awake and asking questions about cattle prices that Clara answered accurately and completely because she'd learned he didn't like being talked down to. "So Carson paid more than Croft would have, Leo asked. 14% more, Clara said. Leo processed that. Was Croft stealing? Hugh glanced over the boy's head at Clara. He was paying less than was fair, Clara said. Whether that's stealing depends on what was written in the agreement, which is why agreements need to be specific. She paused. What he and his uncle were doing together, building toward a foreclosure so that the land could be bought cheap afterward, that's closer to stealing. Yes. Leo was quiet for a moment. Why does someone do that? Because they can, Clara said. Because Hugh was a good rancher and not a businessman, and Croft understood how to use that gap, because nobody was watching the numbers. You watched them, Leo said. I did. He seemed to find this satisfying. He turned to Hugh. You should have had someone watching the numbers sooner. I know that now, Hugh said. Clara could have watched them. Clara wasn't here sooner. Leo thought about this carefully. Well, he said finally, with the blunt logic of a 9-year-old, she's here now. Hugh didn't say anything to that, but the side of his mouth moved in the way it did when he was trying not to let something show. Francis Hartley accepted the mortgage payment with the careful efficiency of a man who understood exactly what had just happened in his bank and preferred to process it without editorial comment. He counted the money. He stamped the documents. He produced a receipt with the deliberateness of someone who understood that this particular piece of paper had weight beyond its face value. He handed it to Clara. She looked at it. The numbers were right. She'd known they would be. She'd counted the cash 3 times between the ranch and Harding. But there was something about seeing the bank's stamp on the receipt that made it real in a way the numbers alone hadn't quite managed. She handed it to Hugh. He held it for a moment without speaking. He read it the way you read something you want to make sure you're reading correctly. Then he folded it and put it in his chest pocket, and he stood up from the chair across from Hartley's desk, and he thanked the man, not warmly, but sincerely. On the way out, Hartley said, "Mrs. Voss?" She turned. He had the expression of a man choosing his words with care. "I've made some inquiries since our last meeting," he said, "into the Denor account history, and into certain other matters." He paused. "I believe there are some internal reviews that will be taking place in the coming weeks, regarding the loan restructuring decisions." Another pause. "I thought you'd want to know." Clara looked at him steadily. "Is Ezra Croft still employed here?" Hartley's expression answered the question before he did. "As of this morning," he said carefully, "Mr. Croft has taken a leave of absence." "I see," Clara said. She walked out into the Harding afternoon with the receipt in her hand, and Hugh beside her and Leo already at the wagon demanding to know if they could get something to eat before going home. And she thought about Ezra Croft on leave, and Silas Croft with no herd and no ranch, and no mechanism left to pull the threads he'd spent 6 years arranging. It wasn't justice, exactly. She'd lived long enough to know that justice was rarely as complete as the word suggested. Silas Croft would find other schemes and other marks, probably. She couldn't fix the whole of what he was. But she'd fix this piece of it. She'd fix Denor Ranch's piece of it. And that was what she'd come here to do. She handed Leo enough coins for a piece of pie at the bakery across the street and told him to be back at the wagon in 20 minutes. He was gone before she'd finished the sentence. Mrs. Alderton was at her window when Clara stopped by to post one final letter, a note to the last of the outstanding debtors, confirming that the matter of their debt would be settled over the next 30 days and that no further action was required. Tying up the loose ends. The postmistress looked at Clara's face, then at Hugh standing at the wagon, then back at Clara. "Done?" she asked. "Done," Clara said. Mrs. Alderton stamped the letter with more satisfaction than the act strictly required. "I heard Ezra Croft isn't at the bank today," she said, with the studied casualness of a woman who absolutely already knew everything and was offering Clara the chance to confirm. "I heard something similar," Clara said. Mrs. Alderton nodded. She set the letter in the outbox. Then she looked at Clara over her spectacles, that direct, assessing look she'd given her on the very first day. Except this time it had something different in it. Not warmth exactly, respect maybe, of the undemonstrative kind. "You did good," she said. Clara took it. She knew better than to deflect it. "Thank you for your help," she said. "I didn't do much." "You told me to see Hartley directly," Clara said. "That was enough." Mrs. Alderton made a sound that wasn't quite a response and went back to her sorting. Clara walked back to the wagon and climbed up, and Leo came running from the bakery with pie on his chin and the particular gait of a child who knows he's technically on time, but only just. But the ride home was longer than the ride out somehow. Not in distance, but in the quality of the silence, which had changed into something different. Not tense, not anticipatory, just present. The three of them on the wagon bench in the late afternoon light, the horses finding their own pace, the land opening out on both sides. After a while, Leo fell asleep. He did it without ceremony, just tilted sideways until his head was on Clara's arm again, and this time she felt the weight of it settle and didn't shift away. Hugh glanced over. "He does that," he said. "I know," she said. "This is the second time." "He doesn't do it with everyone." He said it quietly, looking at the road. "He didn't do it with Mrs. Garrity, not once in 3 years." Clara looked at Leo's sleeping face, the flour on his shirt from the bakery, the boot that was on the wrong foot, which she'd noticed at the bakery and decided wasn't the moment to correct. "He's a good boy," she said. "He's had a hard time of it," Hugh said. "His mother—" He stopped. Started again. "She wasn't a bad person. She just couldn't hold her life together enough to hold on to him, too. I took him because there wasn't anyone else, and I don't regret it, but I know I'm not always—" He exhaled. "I'm not easy. I know that." "You're consistent," Clara said. "For a child who's had inconsistency, that matters more than easy." Hugh was quiet for a while. "I used to think I was doing fine on my own. Ranch was running, boy was fed, accounts were—well, I thought they were fine." "Things look fine from some distances," Clara said. "Yeah." He looked at the road. "Then you came and the distance changed." She didn't answer that directly. The road curved and the light went long and golden, the way Texas light does in the late afternoon, when the heat finally backs off and the world looks like something a painter would be pleased with, and Clara sat with the weight of Leo's head on her arm and the receipt in her bag, and thought about what she'd written on that first night, Denor Ranch, current position, and what the current position actually was now. Safe, solvent, still standing. Not perfect. Hugh had debts of his own that weren't financial, the tendency to withdraw, to make decisions alone, to underestimate what he didn't understand. She had her own. The wariness she carried like a second skin. The habit of not trusting things that looked stable because stable things had a history of not being what they looked like. The part of her that had been braced for this to collapse at some point. The Carson deal, the bank, Croft doing something more drastic, because experience had taught her that things tended to collapse. They hadn't collapsed. She was still adjusting to that. 3 weeks after the mortgage was paid, a letter arrived from Millfield. Ren Carson, writing to confirm his interest in a standing arrangement, first right of purchase on the Denor spring herd for the next 3 seasons, at the agreed rate with annual adjustment for market conditions. Claire read it twice. Then she went and found Hugh in the barn, where he was doing something complicated with a harness that had been mended twice already and probably needed replacing. She handed him the letter. He read it. He set down the harness. He read it again. "He wants a standing arrangement," he said. 3 seasons, she said, with a fair rate clause built in, no broker taking a cut in the middle. Hugh looked at the letter for another moment. "You wrote to him about this?" "I suggested it," she said, "in my last letter to him. I told him that if the quality of this season's cattle was representative, which it was, and if he was interested in a reliable supplier with no middleman, we should talk about what that looked like." Hugh put the letter down on the workbench. He looked at it. He had that expression she'd come to know, the recalibrating one, the one that happened when she'd done something he hadn't thought to do himself, and he was working out how to respond to it without it being a confrontation. "You did that without asking me," he said. "I suggested it," she said. He responded, "You're reading the letter. Nothing is agreed until you agree to it." "But you thought of it." "Yes." "And wrote the letter." "Yes." He looked up. "Clara." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for weeks now. Not Mrs. Voss, just her name. said with a directness that had its own particular weight. I need to ask you something. She waited. The 12 months, he said. The arrangement. It's been, 6 weeks? So there are 10 months left. About that, she said. I want to change the arrangement, he said. She looked at him steadily. How? He picked up the harness again, then put it down, which was as close as she'd seen Hugh Dunor come to fidgeting. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying things that aren't practical. Then say the practical version, she said. You usually do. He looked at her. Something in his face was open in a way she didn't often see. Not vulnerable exactly, because Hugh Dunor didn't do vulnerable without a fight, but honest, undefended. I want you to stay, he said, not as my bookkeeper, not on any 12-month arrangement. I want you to stay because this ranch is better with you in it, and so is Leo, and so... He stopped. So am I. That's the practical version. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She'd had exactly one marriage. It had been a mixed thing, good years and hard years, and a man she'd loved in the way you love someone you've built something with, even when the thing is imperfect and sometimes leaning. She'd spent 3 years after Martin's death telling herself she was done with arrangements of the permanent kind, done with handing her stability over to another person's decisions. She'd meant it when she said it. She still meant most of it. But she was standing in a barn in Texas looking at a man who had put her name on the third plate at the dinner table on the first night without being asked, who had listened when she told him his numbers were wrong instead of telling her she didn't understand, who had ridden to Harding and stood outside a bank because he wouldn't let her go into difficulty alone, even though she hadn't asked for company. He wasn't a simple man. He wasn't an easy one. He had his own hard walls and his own silences, and the particular blindness of someone who'd been alone long enough to mistake isolation for self-sufficiency. Neither was she simple. Neither was she easy. I'll stay, she said, but I want it plain between us. I'm not a housekeeper who also does the accounts. I'm your partner in this ranch, equal say in the business decisions, equal at the table, which we already do, but I want it said. He looked at her. That's what I meant. Then say it that way next time, she said. I said what I meant, he said. I said stay. You said stay. I'm telling you what stay means. He was quiet for a moment, then, equal say. Equal say, she confirmed. Equal at the table. We already do that. Then we already do most of it, he said. Almost, she said. Something shifted in his expression. He reached out and picked up the harness, and then he said without looking at her, I was thinking about asking you something else, something less practical. Hugh. What? Ask the less practical thing, she said. I can handle impractical. I've been handling impractical for 6 weeks. He put the harness down again. He turned and looked at her directly. And there was something in his face that was both uncomfortable and decided, the expression of a man who has made up his mind and is going to say the thing even though saying it is hard. Will you marry me? He said. It wasn't a question with a question mark exactly. It was more like a statement that he was leaving room for her to argue with. Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the ledger on the windowsill. She thought about 3 coins on a counter and a man turning away. She thought about a third plate at a table and a boy who slept against her arm. Yes, she said. Practical enough for you? He asked. Ask me again in a year, she said. I'll have a better answer. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll ask in a year then too, he said. What? Leo took the news with the seriousness of a person who had opinions about it. So you're staying, he said to Clara that evening, with his fork in his hand and his supper getting cold. I'm staying, she said. And you're going to marry Uncle Hugh. Yes. Leo looked at Hugh. Did you ask her right? I believe I did, Hugh said. Leo looked back at Clara. Did he? Well enough, she said. Leo considered this for a moment. Then he went back to his supper, apparently satisfied, and said nothing further on the subject, which was, Clara had come to understand, Leo's version of approval. He didn't make speeches. He just went back to the thing he was doing, comfortable enough to stop worrying about it. She understood that. She was a person who went back to the numbers when things were settled. It was how she knew things were actually settled. The ledger sat on the windowsill in the room that was no longer just the room off the kitchen. It was her room, and then their room, and then simply part of the house the way all the other rooms were parts of it. The ledger changed over time. The first pages, the ones from the early weeks, were dense and anxious, crowded with calculations, marginal notes, numbers crossed out and recalculated. The later pages were cleaner, more certain. The handwriting of a person who knows what they're doing and trusts the work. Months passed, and then a year, and then more than that. Silas Croft's name came up once more, about 8 months after the mortgage was paid, when a man from the county attorney's office came by the ranch asking questions about the Harding County Bank's lending practices over the past decade. Clara sat with him at the kitchen table for 2 hours and answered every question precisely and showed him her documentation. She heard later that Ezra Croft had left the county entirely. She heard even later that Silas had sold his brokerage and moved somewhere east. Whether that constituted consequence enough for 6 years of deliberate harm, she couldn't say. Probably not. But it was what was available, and she'd made her peace with the gap between what was available and what was deserved. That gap was everywhere, in every life. The useful thing was to do what you could within it and not exhaust yourself mourning the rest. The ranch grew, not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was the slow, unglamorous kind of growth that happens when a place is being managed properly and the people running it understand both the land and the numbers and don't let either one run away from them. The herd rebuilt over 2 seasons. Carson's standing arrangement held. A 4th hand was hired, then a 5th. Leo grew faster than the ranch, the way children do. He went from 9 to 12 and then to 15, and the boy who'd asked what perceptive meant turned into someone who used it correctly in a sentence and then corrected his own sentence because he thought he'd used it slightly wrong, which made Clara set down her coffee and look at him with something that was not quite pride and was something more than that. He learned the accounts. She taught him the same way she'd learned, slowly, practically, with real numbers from the real ranch so that the arithmetic meant something and didn't just exist in a void. Hugh watched their lessons sometimes from across the room, not participating, just present, and Clara knew it was his way of learning alongside Leo without having to admit he was still learning. She didn't say anything about it. Some things you let people do in the way they need to do them. There were hard years, too. A dry summer that hit the grazing hard and forced them to sell more of the herd than they wanted. A winter that took 2 of the older cattle and left the fence on the north side so damaged it cost more to repair than they'd budgeted. Hugh's back, which had been an ongoing complaint for years, got worse enough one winter that he couldn't ride for 6 weeks, and Clara ran the ranch decisions alone during that time, which was not different from how she usually operated but felt different without him there at the table to push back on her assumptions. She hadn't realized how much she'd come to rely on his pushback until it wasn't there. She told him that, when he was better, in the direct way she'd learned was the only kind that worked between them. He said, "I didn't know I was useful for pushback." "You're useful for several things," she said. "Pushback is one of them." "Good to know," he said, and he went back to work. That was mostly how it was between them. Not dramatic, not effortless either, but real, in the way that things built by hand and maintained with attention are real, not because they're perfect, but because they've survived being imperfect, and that's a different kind of solid. Clara's ledger filled up, and she started a second one, then a third. On the cover of the third, she wrote, Dunor Ranch, current position. Below it, she wrote a number that was different in every way from the first number she'd written under those same words. Not the deficit, not the gap, not the careful accounting of how close they were to disaster. It was the other kind of number, the kind that meant something had been built. She looked at it for a moment, just a moment. Then she turned to the next blank page and began.